Dog was abandoned with puppies and tied to a pole near a highway. What happened next will break your heart. Have you ever looked into the eyes of an abandoned dog and felt something tighten in your chest? Those eyes that carry an invisible weight, a story that no one bothered to listen to. They don't need words to tell everything they've experienced. Just one look, a look that begs, that cries, that waits. But how long will it wait? How long can hope last before it goes out? There, on the side of the highway, a thin and fragile dog was trembling. The cold asphalt stole the heat he was already lacking, and the biting wind was not just a warning of a difficult night, but of a lifetime marked by struggle. The body no longer had the strength to bark, move, or even show fear. She was just there, lying there motionless, as if existence itself was already an unbearable effort. But his eyes, oh, his eyes, said it all. There was a painful silence on that road, the silence of those who already understand that shouting is no use, that the suffering of an abandoned dog goes unnoticed in the rush of the world. But there was something else there, a last ray of hope. The night before had been cruel. The early morning cold seemed like an implacable enemy, infiltrating the bones. She cowered, trying to protect the small bodies beside her. Newborn puppies, fragile, blind to the harsh reality that awaited them. They cuddled up to her, seeking the warmth and security that every mother should be able to provide. But what to do when even that was denied to you? Her body was shaking, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. She didn't know what sleep was anymore. Always alert, always attentive to the slightest sign of threat. The road wasn't home, but it was all they had. The cars passed too quickly. The headlights illuminated his thin body for a few seconds and continued on their way, ignoring his presence as if he were just another piece of the landscape. And hunger. Hunger was his cruelest companion. His stomach churned, clenching in search of something that wasn't there. How long had she not eaten? 2 days? 3? I no longer knew how to count. Time, for those fighting to survive, stops being a sequence of hours and becomes just a succession of challenges. She no longer felt strength in her paws. Every day it became more difficult to get up to look for food. But even without food, even without strength, their young came first. They suckled, sucking what little was left of her. She didn't push them away, even though her own body was as empty as the road around it, because she was a mother, and mothers don't give up. Their dirty, matted fur hid scars that told stories no one asked. Would I have been loved one day? Would it have had a name? Abandonment always arrives without explanation. One day, you will have a home. In the other, it is left behind without understanding why. She didn't run after humans. I had already learned that many were not. Good. Some just looked away, pretending not to see her. Others laughed, threw scraps of food to watch her run, and when she ran, kicked her away as if her hunger were entertainment. Fear was a constant shadow. The noise of cars, the horns, the wind stirring up dust and dry leaves. Everything said that this was not a safe place. But leaving was not an option. Her puppies depended on her. Even without strength, even without hope, she stayed. But until when? She blinked slowly. Sleep came, heavy, dangerous. His eyes were tired, but closing them could mean never opening them again. Instinct screamed that I needed to resist, but the body no longer obeyed. Her kits were still breathing, little hearts beating against their cold skin. They didn't know the danger. They didn't understand that the only thing between them and the end was that weakened mother. And so she resisted, because as long as she was there, they still had a chance. Looking into the eyes of an abandoned dog and feeling its pain is something that breaks your heart. But every story shared can save lives. Comment: every dog deserves love to show that they are not alone. Subscribe and leave your like so this story reaches more people. It was then that something different happened. The sound of footsteps breaking the silence of the highway made the dog's heart race. Humans. His body instinctively stiffened. Not to run. Running away was not an option. The puppies were there, so fragile, so defenseless. Running would mean abandoning them, and that no matter what she would never do. Instead, he lowered his ears, curled up, wrapping the little ones with what was left of him. She tried to become invisible, to make herself as small as possible, hoping that that human would simply pass by without noticing her. But the person didn't pass. It stopped. Poor thing. The voice broke the harshness of the moment. Unlike anything I had ever heard before, it carried no contempt, disgust, or indifference. There was compassion there. The dog looked up, wary. It was a woman. She didn't know what to expect. Humans had been there before, and none of them had brought anything other than frustration and pain. Some didn't even look at him. Others, upon noticing his presence, laughed, as if it were funny to see an animal fighting hunger and cold. They threw scraps of food to attract her, only to shoo her away with their feet when she approached. She had learned, with visible and invisible scars, that kindness was a rare and often cruelly feigned gift, but this woman, as she looked different. Still, fear spoke louder. Every muscle of the dog remained tense, her eyes fixed on the stranger's movements. Any sudden gesture and she would be ready to protect her cubs in the only way she still could, by placing herself between them and danger. But the woman didn't move forward. He didn't try to touch her by force. He didn't hold out his hands in a threatening way. He slowly lowered himself, respecting the space between them, and then gently extended his hand. He didn't demand anything, he didn't pressure, just waited. The dog didn't growl, it didn't advance, but he didn't wag his tail either. He just stood there, motionless, watching her with eyes that weren't just eyes. They were windows into a hurt soul, full of questions that only a dog can ask without needing words. Are you going to hurt me? Are you going to laugh at me? Are you going to give me something just to take away later? Are you going to make me believe I can trust, only to abandon me once again? The woman held her gaze, and something in her seemed to say no. After a few seconds, the woman opened the bag carefully, as if she knew that any sudden gesture could scare her even more. His fingers touched a piece of bread, not too big, but enough for an empty stomach. Slowly, she placed him on the ground, close enough for the dog to smell it, but far enough away for her not to feel threatened. The aroma invaded the dog's senses. The bread, although simple and dry, was the smell of survival. Her body reacted before she could even think. Her stomach contracted in a spasm of painful hunger, reminding her that for days, nothing but air and despair had filled her insides. For an instant, his mouth watered. His instinct screamed. All it took was a quick movement, a single push, and that piece of food would be yours. She could devour him in seconds. She could alleviate, even if minimally, the agony. That was gnawing at his insides. But she didn't do any of that. With almost reverent slowness, he leaned forward and, instead of biting the bread, he gently pushed it with his nose towards his cubs. The woman opened her eyes wide in surprise, unable to contain the lump that formed in her throat. Her chest tightened, as if something had hit her right in the center of her heart. The dog, even weak, even exhausted, even though she knew that the food could be her last chance to stay standing, chose not to eat. He chose to give it to his puppies. They came first. They would always come first because she wasn't just a street dog. She was a mother who would sacrifice everything, even her own life, to keep her children alive. The woman felt her eyes water. It wasn't just pity, it wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, something that came from a place of raw empathy, from a quiet, visceral understanding of what it means to love to the point of forgetting oneself. In that instant, in that brief, painful gesture, she knew she couldn't just get up and go on her way. She couldn't leave, not without helping them. But what she didn't know yet was that that decision would change everything. Have you ever felt that feeling that something bad was about to happen? A chill down your spine, a tightness in your chest, as if the air around you had suddenly become heavier? The dog felt it before she even heard the man's voice. His body, already weakened by hunger and fatigue, contracted even more when that sound cut through the silence of the road. A scream, dry and harsh, filled with something she knew all too well: contempt. The woman, who until then had been crouched down, watching the dog and her puppies with a look full of compassion, was startled when she heard the unexpected voice. He stood up quickly, his eyes finding the figure of a man approaching with firm steps, his face marked by impatience and irritation. "Leave that animal there," he barked, shaking his head indignantly, as if the scene he saw before him was absurd. This type of dog does not deserve to be rescued. The dog shrank even more, trying to become invisible. His body was already used to this type of reaction. Humans who saw no value in her, who saw her only as a nuisance. The look he gave her was not one of pity, nor of indifference. It was of revulsion, as if she were dirty, disposable, unworthy of any gesture of kindness. The woman frowned, surprised and disgusted by the words she had just heard. He still tried to argue, his voice choked with indignation. "But she has puppies. They will die here if no one does anything." The man snorted, crossing his arms. "So what? It's not my problem. This animal must have been thrown here by someone who didn't want it anymore. If the owner didn't even want it, why should I care?" The woman's chest rose and fell rapidly. It wasn't possible that someone could be so cruel, so insensitive. She looked at the dog, still motionless, her gaze downcast, resigned. It was as if she already knew what would happen, as if I had heard it before so many times that I didn't expect anything different. The bitch knew what it was like to be rejected. The woman, on the other hand, couldn't accept it. His desire was to scream, to confront that man and say that every living being deserves compassion, but she knew it wouldn't help. People like him were not convinced by arguments. Her heart sank. She looked back at the dog and her puppies, a growing anguish building within her. How could I just leave them there? How could she turn her back and continue on her way, knowing that that mother, exhausted and hungry, would remain stuck on that road, vulnerable to the cold, to hunger, to neglect? But she was alone. She swallowed hard and took a deep breath. I couldn't confront that man there, at that moment, but something inside her said that the story wasn't over yet. Without saying anything else, she gave the dog one last look, as if silently promising that this wouldn't be the last time they would see each other. Then he turned and walked away, feeling the crushing weight of injustice with every step he took, but her heart wouldn't let her forget. The dog watched her go, without moving, without making a single sound. She didn't ask for help, not because he didn't need to, but because he learned the hard way possible that not always asking makes a difference. The wind blew harder, stirring up dust and dry leaves around her. And the cubs. The cars continued to pass by, completely ignoring the small scene of silent struggle for survival. With each step she took, the feeling of moving away from something she shouldn't abandon grew inside her like an uncomfortable pain, a weight that tightened her chest and made her breathing irregular. The cold wind from the road hit her face, but what really froze her was the memory of those eyes, the bitch's eyes. A lackluster look, without hope, without the expectation that someone would do something for her. She tried to push the image away, tried to justify to herself that she had done what she could, but there was no conviction in his thoughts. The dog's haggard face remained in his mind, as did the scene of the puppies huddled together in search of warmth that their mother, weak and weakened, was no longer able to offer. They were so small, so fragile. The world was still a mystery to them. They didn't know what danger was. They didn't know the evil, the cruelty of rejection. All they knew was that they needed her, and she was there, resisting, fighting, even if alone. And then, as if it were a cruel echo inside his mind, the man's words came back, sharp as blades. That kind of dog doesn't deserve to be rescued. Who decides this? Who has the right to define which lives deserve help and which do not? Since when did existing become a privilege, not a right? His heart sank. That sentence carried a kind of coldness that she couldn't understand. Something that hurt not just the bitch, but everything that was right, everything that was fair. She stopped walking. He looked around, as if the world had suddenly become quieter. Cars still passed by, horns sounded in the distance, but inside, everything seemed suspended. A scream, a dull revolt took over his chest. No, she couldn't just leave. If he did that, if he ignored that scene and went on with his life, he would never forgive himself. How would I sleep at night knowing that, at that exact moment, that dog was still cowering in the cold without strength, her puppies increasingly weak, defenseless, waiting for help that might never come? How could I pretend it didn't matter? It was an unbearable thought, and it was at that moment that she knew she would come back. It didn't matter if he had to face that man again. It didn't matter if he didn't know exactly what to do or where to take the dog and puppies. She would find a way. I would do whatever was necessary, because that bitch wasn't just a street dog. She was a mother, and no mother should be left behind. That night was long. The woman tried everything to distract herself, but her mind insisted on returning to the same image. The dog, huddled in the cold, the weak and defenseless puppies, and the empty look of someone who has already lost hope. No matter how many times he tried to close his eyes and push away that thought, it always came back. It was as if something inside her screamed, that there was still something to be done, that this story couldn't end like this. And deep down she knew she couldn't live in peace while those little ones were in danger. Dawn brought a decision that had already been made in his heart, long before his mind admitted it. She wouldn't go back alone. I needed help. I needed more hands, more hearts willing to make a difference. I knew that it wasn't enough to free the dog and the puppies. It was necessary to have somewhere to take them, to guarantee that they weren't just exchanging one suffering for another. He picked up the phone and started making calls. He told the story to each person he knew could help. He described the dog's look. He spoke of the cold, the hunger, the brutality of the words he had heard the day before. And people listened. One by one, they felt the same tightness in their chest that she felt. Within a few hours, he managed to gather a small group of volunteers. Some were acquaintances. Others were just people who, like her, couldn't ignore when a life needed help. They gathered blankets, boxes to transport the puppies, food and water. They still didn't know exactly where they would take the dog, but that was a problem to solve later. The most important thing now was to get them out of that place before it was too late. The drive to the highway felt longer than it had the night before. Each kilometer covered increased anxiety, the fear that something had happened in that time. When they finally arrived, the scene was still the same, and at the same time different. The dog was still there, motionless, but something about her seemed even more fragile, as if the little energy she had left was slipping away. The cubs barely moved, just breathing slowly, seeking warmth from their mother's thin body. And then, upon seeing the humans approaching, the dog slightly raised her head. His eyes met the woman's, and for an instant, something shone there. She remembered. She remembered the soft voice, the outstretched hand that didn't force her, the piece of bread that wasn't taken from her. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, he didn't just see threat in the human presence. There was fear, of course. Fear that this was all just another disappointment. Fear that, in the end, nothing would change. But there was something more. An almost imperceptible ray of hope. The volunteers moved calmly, opening the boxes for the puppies and spreading out food and water. One of them held a collar, slowly approaching to put it on. The dog, while another prepared a blanket to wrap her. And then one of the puppies let out a small whimper. It was at that moment that the dog reacted. Her eyes widened, and even though she was weak, she tried to put herself between the puppies and the strangers. It was a reflex. She didn't know they were there to help. All she knew was that she always had to protect her babies alone. The woman knelt down and cautiously reached out her hand, keeping her voice low, soft, like the night before. There was no rush. He let the dog smell his scent, watch his eyes, and little by little understand that there was no danger. Minutes passed before the dog lowered her ears a little and allowed the collar to be placed. A small gesture, but full of meaning. She trusted. Little by little, the puppies were carefully collected and placed in a box lined with a warm blanket. The mother, although still afraid, did not resist when one of the volunteers took her in his arms. His body was cold, too weak to offer any resistance. The weight of hunger and fatigue completely dominated her. But even so, his gaze remained fixed on the puppies the entire time, as if making sure they were still there, that nothing would separate them now. They had been saved. But then came the new question: where to take them? The first moments away from that road were silent. In the car seat, wrapped in a soft blanket, the dog finally allowed herself to close her eyes, even if only for a few minutes. His body, accustomed to the biting cold of the asphalt and the insecurity of each new day, now rested on something different, but his mind remained alert. The puppies were there, breathing softly inside the lined box, and for a moment it seemed like everything was finally okay. She was safe, they were safe, but something inside her wouldn't rest. The woman drove slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The car smelled of food and blankets, and the presence of that exhausted mother, and her puppies made the environment different, more dense, as if each one there carried an untold story. She knew she couldn't take them home directly. They needed care, a safe space where they could recover, and that's why he took them to an improvised shelter, a small place run by volunteers who took in rescued animals. It wasn't big, but it was clean, cozy, and there the dog would have food, water, and a quiet place to rest. When they arrived, the puppies were gently placed in a makeshift bed, with warm cloths and milk to help them gain strength. The dog, still weak, was placed in a protected area, surrounded by low fences, so that she would not feel cornered. At first, everything seemed fine. She lay down next to the kits, watched them snuggle against each other and sighed, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. But that moment of apparent tranquility was short-lived. On the first night, while the volunteers were organizing the space and checking on the other animals, a different noise caught their attention. When they got closer, they saw the dog standing, pacing from side to side, as if she was restless. His gaze, once heavy with exhaustion, now had something different, an agitated glow, as if something was wrong. She didn't lie down. She didn't rest. She didn't even look at the puppies. Instead, its nose lifted into the air, sniffing for something unseen, and its breathing became more rapid. The hours passed, and the restlessness increased. In the morning, volunteers found her trying to climb the makeshift fence, her posture completely different from the day before. It wasn't a common fear. It wasn't distrust for the new environment. It was something else. There was an urgency in his movements, a quiet desperation in his eyes. When someone approached, she didn't shrink like before. She didn't show fear of humans, but he also didn't accept the touch. He avoided it. He insisted on trying to leave. The woman who rescued her watched everything with concern. That was not the expected reaction of an animal that was finally safe after so much suffering. Something didn't make sense. She looked at the puppies, at the food, at the warm blanket where they were lying, and nothing explained that restlessness. What was making the bitch so agitated? What made her seem so desperate to get out of there? The answer would come shortly after, and it would be something no one expected. The dog's restlessness was becoming impossible to ignore. Time passed. The puppies nursed and slept warmly in the shelter, but she didn't seem to allow herself to rest. Even weak, even fed, there was something about her that didn't fit into the scene of relief that everyone expected to see. Instinct spoke louder. She didn't give in to comfort. She didn't accept the security that was now offered to her. His eyes remained attentive, his body in a state of alert, his anxious steps going from one side to the other, sniffing the air as if there was something much bigger that no one could see there. The volunteers watched, exchanging worried looks. They tried everything. They offered food, affection, left her alone for a while to make her feel comfortable, but nothing helped. What intrigued them most was the fact that she didn't try to run away out of fear, as other dogs had done before. No, it was different. She wanted to leave, but not to get away from there. His look wasn't one of panic, but one of need. She knew exactly where she wanted to go. The woman who rescued her felt a tightness in her chest. There was something unfinished in that story. I couldn't ignore what was happening. And then he decided to do something no one had tried yet. Open the door and let her out. The volunteers hesitated. What if she ran away? What if I never came back? But something inside her said this bitch wasn't thinking about herself. When the lock was unlocked and the entrance to the shelter was opened, everyone waited for her to hesitate, to shrink in doubt, to look at the puppies before making any decision. But no, without even wasting a second, the dog took off, her breathing quickening, her still weakened body responding to the instinct that was propelling her towards a destiny that only she knew. The woman followed. The volunteers looked at each other for a brief moment before deciding to follow her as well. They didn't know what to expect, but they needed to find out where this bitch was taking them. They quickened their pace, running through empty streets and fields, avoiding holes and obstacles along the way, but nothing seemed to slow them down. It was as if the fatigue that had dominated her until that moment no longer existed. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, his breathing heaving, his paws touching the earth with a determination that no one understood, but that no one dared to interrupt. The dog followed a route that seemed familiar. Before long, the scene began to become familiar. The road, the noise of cars, the smell of dust mixed in, the wind, the place where she had been found. The woman's heart raced. What was she looking for? Why would I go back there? It was then that they realized that she would not stop on the road. She continued running, turning onto a side path, where the asphalt gave way to uneven ground and vegetation grew out of control. The undergrowth was dense, full of dry leaves and twisted branches that made passage difficult. Still, she advanced without hesitation, sniffing the ground, following an invisible trail. The volunteers struggled to keep up with her, avoiding the branches that scratched their arms and legs. The woman tried to keep her gaze fixed on the dog, afraid of losing sight of her. The air seemed heavier there, and the silence was interrupted only by the sound of leaves being trampled. until suddenly the dog stopped. Her eyes searched a specific spot among the foliage, and then, without hesitation, she advanced, burying her snout in the dry vegetation. The woman advanced slowly, feeling each beat of her heart resonate like a drum inside her chest. The air around him seemed heavier, as if time had decided to drag on, prolonging that moment of uncertainty. The volunteers were close behind, but no one dared to say anything. There was something sacred about the scene before them, something that transcended the simple action of rescuing an animal. It was then that the fragile sound cut through the silence. So low, so delicate, it could easily have been swallowed by the wind. A soft moan, almost like a cry for help, muffled by the earth. The world around seemed to freeze. The woman knelt, ignoring the cold, damp earth that clung to her clothes. With trembling hands, he carefully removed the dry branches, feeling his heart tighten even more with each leaf removed. The dog at his side watched with silent anxiety, breathing rapidly, her ears tense, her eyes fixed on the exact spot where the puppies were hiding. And then, among the dust and dirt and leaves that accumulated on the ground, she saw them. Small ones, fragile, shivering from the cold. Their tiny bodies were huddled together, huddled against each other, trying to stay warm the only way they knew how, by staying together. They were so similar to the first rescued puppies that the woman felt a pang of guilt for not noticing sooner. How come no one imagined there could be more? How could they doubt that mother, interpret her despair as fear, when in fact it was love? The dog moved quickly, approaching the little ones and starting to lick them desperately, as if making sure they were alive, that none of them had been lost forever. His thin body was shaking, but it was no longer from the cold or hunger. It was for emotion, for relief, for finally being there alongside all of his children. The woman couldn't hold back her tears. She never wanted to run away. I never wanted to leave the shelter. He never wanted to escape the hands that finally offered him help. She just wanted to go, back for those who still needed her. Her instinct wouldn't let her rest because she knew. She knew her cubs were there, alone, hidden, defenseless, waiting for a mother who would never have the courage to leave them behind. The volunteers were silent, each absorbing the weight of that revelation. The dog, who before seemed just restless, was now living proof of something that few completely understood. A mother's love, even in the face of hunger, tiredness, fear, always speaks louder. She never gave up. Even without strength, even without food, even without guarantees that she would be able to return, she tried. He tried in every way to show that something was still wrong, that his mission was not complete. The woman reached out her hand, and for the first time the dog didn't flinch. She didn't turn away, she didn't look around, she didn't hesitate. He just accepted the touch, because now she knew she was no longer alone, and never would be again. The silence that took over the thicket was no ordinary silence. It was heavy, emotionally charged, almost palpable. The volunteers were still standing around, taking in everything that had just happened. The dog, previously so restless, now curled up next to the puppies she had just found again, licking each one as if to ensure that they were really there, alive, breathing. His gaze no longer held only fear and exhaustion. Now there was something deeper, a silent relief, a calm acceptance. Finally, everyone was together. The woman who had rescued her felt a lump form in her throat. He never imagined that that simple decision to follow the dog would reveal something so moving. How could they have thought she just wanted to run away? How did they not realize that all along she just wanted to complete her mission as a mother? But now there was no more time for regrets. They needed to act. The hidden cubs were even weaker than the first ones. Their small bodies trembled, their breaths were short and unsteady. It was not just the cold of the night that had punished them, but hunger, fear, abandonment. If they had delayed a few more hours, perhaps a day, it might have been too late. The woman hurriedly took off her coat and laid it on the floor, creating an improvised nest. One by one, the puppies were placed there, their tiny bodies almost disappearing into the fabric. The dog watched everything, still tense, her eyes following every movement. Even weak, even barely able to support herself, she didn't look away, as if she feared that it was all just a dream about to come apart. The volunteers hurried over. They needed to get them out of there as quickly as possible. The makeshift shelter where they had left the first puppies was already full, and the situation became even more complicated. Where would they all take them? Who could take in an exhausted mother and now twice as many puppies? The group began walking back, the dog following closely behind, hesitant with each step, always looking back, to make sure no one was left behind this time. The woman held the coat with the puppies against her chest, feeling the fragility of each one. Her heart was beating fast, the worry of what they would do next weighing heavily on her shoulders. Rescuing them was just the beginning. Now they needed to find a real solution. The way back to the car seemed longer than before. The entire time, the woman's thoughts revolved around a single question. Where would they stay? The shelter had no more space. Time was against them. Every hour lost meant less chance of recovery for those little ones. They needed warmth, food, and most of all, a home where they could feel safe for the first time in their lives. When they reached the car, the dog stopped next to the open door, looking inside, then at her puppies, then at the woman. There was no longer fear in his expression, but there was a doubt. For so long, his only certainty was that the world was not safe. But now, something felt different. The woman reached out her hand, and this time, without hesitation, she got into the car. The engine was started, and the vehicle headed towards the shelter, but the atmosphere among the volunteers was not calm. They knew this was just a temporary solution. Everyone was gathered, they were alive, but the fight was still far from over. At the shelter, the puppies were quickly accommodated, receiving warm milk and blankets. The space, already small before, now seemed even smaller. The volunteers' gazes met. Everyone was wondering the same thing. And now, the woman looked at the dog who was now lying in a corner, surrounded by all her puppies. His breathing was still heavy, his body still bore the signs of abandonment, but his look said something different. For the first time, she seemed at peace. His family was complete, but the story wasn't over yet. Finding them was just the first step. The real challenge would begin now. They needed a home, and there was no time to waste. There was something different in the dog's eyes that night. She was surrounded by her puppies, safe, protected by soft blankets and the heat of the lamps that heated the small makeshift shelter. But even so, his gaze still carried something distant, a shadow of something that no one there could fully understand. She didn't just look tired. It seemed to carry a silent longing, a feeling that I couldn't express in words, but that was there, in the eyes that sometimes got lost in any point, as if they were searching for something beyond the walls of the shelter. The woman who had rescued her felt it. He observed her from afar, noticing the small signs, the way in which, even surrounded by affection and care, the dog still seemed incomplete. Was it just the trauma of abandonment, or was there something more? The next morning, they decided to examine her more closely. Until then, they were focused on the urgency of rescuing the puppies, on ensuring that they all survived, on finding a temporary home. But now that things had calmed down, they were able to look at the dog beyond her recent suffering. One of the volunteers began to gently run his hands over her thin body, feeling the bones protruding beneath the thin skin. That's when they noticed something strange. Right there on his neck, hidden beneath his rough, dirty fur, was a scar, a deep groove, as if something had been there for a long time, marking your skin, leaving a permanent record of something that shouldn't be there. The woman frowned. That scar wasn't from any wound. It was a precise circular mark, a clear sign that one day that dog had worn a collar for too long, perhaps too tight. The silence in the shelter became heavy. If she ever wore a collar, it meant she once had an owner. Someone at some point gave her a name, offered her a home, and somehow she ended up there, alone, on the side of the road, fighting to keep her babies alive. But how? What happened to make a dog that once had a home end up like that? The woman felt a tightness in her chest. Something about that idea bothered her deeply. He looked again at the scar, at the dog's eyes, and realized he needed answers. Having decided, she took some photos of the dog and began a search, posted in rescue groups, sent messages to local shelters, checked lists of lost dogs. But deep down, I didn't expect to find anything. Dogs are abandoned every day, and most of them have no one looking for them. But something about that bitch was different. And then came the surprise. The cell phone shook slightly in the woman's hands as she stared at the photo on the screen. His heart was beating hard, as if he was trying to keep up with the whirlwind of thoughts that were passing through his mind. She blinked, trying to focus her teary eyes on the slightly blurry image. There was no doubt. It was her, The same bitch, the same sweet look, the same mark on the chest. But something about that photo hurt in a different way. In the image, the dog was not skin and bones like she is now. His body wasn't fragile, there wasn't that extreme thinness that made every bone in his ribs stand out. She looked stronger, healthier. His fur, although short, had a shine that now seemed impossible to imagine. But it wasn't just that. Beside her, holding her collar, was a man, an elderly man, with a face marked by time, but with a light smile, a smile that overflowed with affection and complicity. The woman felt a shiver run up her spine. It wasn't possible. Something inside her always said that there was something different about that dog, that distant look meant more than just the trauma of the street. But she never, not for an instant, imagined that someone could be waiting for her, looking for her. The answer came quickly. This man has been looking for this bitch for months. The woman's heart raced. What seemed like another painful rescue, another case of abandonment like so many others, suddenly turned into something much bigger. Her chest tightened at the thought that somewhere, someone was suffering from this bitch's absence. Someone who perhaps still slept every night hoping for a miracle. She swallowed hard and felt her fingers hesitate for a second before touching the number sent to her. He took a deep breath. His chest felt heavy, filled with a mixture of anxiety and hope, and with every second that the call took to be answered, his nervousness grew. Then, finally, a voice answered. "Hello?" The voice was weak, aged, filled with a tiredness that went beyond age. It was a tiredness of the soul, of someone who no longer expects to hear good news. She took a deep breath, trying to control the emotion that made her throat close. "Sir, I think I found your bitch." The silence that followed was long, a heavy silence full of meanings, a silence that spoke more than any words could say. And then, a hiccup. The woman pursed her lips, feeling her own eyes fill with tears before he even said anything. The elderly man's voice carried a fragility that went beyond his age. It was the sound of someone who had lost something precious and spent too long trying to accept that they might never find it again. There was a weight to that question, an almost painful hesitation, as if he feared that this was a mistake, another false hope, another attempt to grasp what had already slipped through his hands for a long time. "Are you sure?" The woman felt her throat close. The air around him seemed to have become thicker, as if everything was suspended in that moment, waiting for the confirmation he so desperately needed. "I looked for her, every day." The words came out low, broken, filled with a feeling so pure that the woman was unable to contain the tears that accumulated in her eyes, because now more than ever, she understood. She looked at the corner of the shelter, where the dog slept, surrounded by her puppies, finally safe, not knowing that, on the other end of that call, someone had never given up on her. Someone who, night after night, kept alive the flame of hope that most people would have snuffed out. How many nights did that man spend looking at his front door, waiting to hear the familiar sound of paws scratching the wood? How many times did he call your name across the empty yard, feeling the silence answering back? How many days did you walk the streets, looking at every dog that passed, hoping that at some point you would meet those eyes you knew so well? The woman closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. I knew I needed to respond, but how could I put into words everything that reunion meant? Yes. His voice was low, almost a whisper. It's her. On the other end of the line, there was a restrained sob, and then a soft cry full of emotion. It wasn't a cry of sadness, but of relief, from someone who waited too long for news that never arrived, and when it finally came, it seemed impossible to believe. My girl. The elderly man's voice broke, suffocated by crying. I thought I would never see her again. The woman clutched the phone tightly, trying to hold back her own tears. He looked again at the dog, who was moving slightly in her sleep, oblivious to the revolution of feelings that was happening around her. How was it possible that two souls, separated by destiny, were still so connected? How did that man never give up, even when everything indicated that there was no more hope? She looked at the puppies, cuddled up, around their mother, and thought of everything that dog had gone through to protect them, the cold, the hunger, the fear, the pain, all the challenges he faced, always fighting to keep them alive. But now perhaps it was time for her to be taken care of. Maybe, after so long, it was time to go home. The woman wiped her tears and took a deep breath before speaking again. Can you come and get her? The silence on the other side was brief, followed by a response filled with such strong emotion that it made her heart squeeze even more. "I'm leaving right now. Have you ever lost something you loved dearly? That kind of loss that hurts in a silent way, that turns the days into an endless wait, an emptiness that is never completely filled?" That's what happened to that man. He had already accepted that he would never see her again. Or at least, that's what he tried to tell himself every day, as he looked out at the empty yard and missed his old companion overwhelmingly. But accepting didn't mean forgetting. He still found himself calling his name without realizing it. I still woke up at dawn hoping to hear her moving at the foot of the bed. I still looked at the gate every morning, hoping against all logic that she was there. That bitch was much more than an animal to him. She was part of the family, their constant shadow, their loyal friend at all times. For years they were together in a simple routine but full of meaning. They walked around the neighborhood every afternoon, he with slow steps and she always at his side, never moving away. They shared the silence of the balcony at dusk, while the cold wind carried the smell of flowers from the small garden he cultivated. On difficult days, she was the one who stayed there, lying near his feet, as if she knew that her presence alone was enough to comfort him. Then came that day. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it seemed to be. He went shopping in town, leaving her in the backyard as usual. But when he returned, she was no longer there. The gate was ajar, something he never let happen. Maybe he had forgotten to lock it properly. Maybe the strong wind had pushed it. He never knew for sure. All she knew was that her best friend had disappeared without a trace. At first he didn't despair. She was smart, she knew the way home. But as the hours passed and she didn't return, fear began to take over. He went looking for her, asking neighbors, walking the streets until his legs hurt, calling her. Name at every corner. When night fell, he was still on the street, his eyes searching every shadow, his heart heavy. The following days were a succession of searches and disappointments. He put up posters, asked people he knew for help, called shelters, but there was no sign of her. Time passed and the city indifferently continued to follow its rhythm, but he didn't give up. Whenever she saw a dog on the street, her heart raced for a second, until she realized it wasn't her. And then the months passed. The yard was silent. The walks became lonely, and he tried to move on, but he could never shake the feeling that somewhere she was still waiting for him. Until that afternoon, his phone rang. Now he was there, standing in front of the shelter, his hands shaking slightly, his heart racing as if he had become a young man again. He didn't know what to expect. He was afraid that it was a mistake, afraid that she wouldn't recognize him anymore, afraid that those months of distance had erased everything they had experienced. The door opened slowly, and then he saw her. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. All the sounds around were erased, the weight of time disappeared, and only those eyes remained. Eyes that he knew better than anything, eyes that had once brought him comfort on difficult days, eyes that one day he feared he would never meet again. But there they were, looking back at him, carrying a story that he didn't yet know, but that he could feel on his skin. She was different. The body, once strong and healthy, now seemed small and fragile, marked by the time they spent apart. The fur no longer had the shine he remembered, and there were scars, some visible, others silent, hidden in the soul. But none of that mattered. He would have recognized those eyes anywhere. The dog raised her head slowly, sniffing the air hesitantly. Something familiar was there, but his tired mind seemed to take a few seconds to understand. The smell, the presence, the way. He stood still, waiting, as if he knew that any sudden movement could scare her. There was something about that man that made her chest tighten, but she couldn't say exactly what, until your eyes met his. And then it all came back. The memories that time tried to erase resurfaced like a whirlwind. The quiet days in the backyard, the slow walks through the streets, the gentle hand that always caressed her behind her ears, the calm voice that called her every morning, the smell, the feeling of being safe, of belonging to someone, to be loved. The thin body, which had previously seemed powerless, rose in an impulse, as if an instinct stronger than any pain was propelling it forward. His paws stumbled on the ground, his heart beating wildly, his tail starting to move frantically before his body even reached its destination. She didn't think, just ran, and he no longer had the strength to stand. The elderly man fell to his knees before she even reached him, and when they finally met, there was no hesitation, there was no fear, there was no doubt. She threw herself at him, putting her nose into his chest, as if she wanted to merge with that presence that had been taken from her for so long. His body trembled. He was whimpering, but it wasn't a cry of pain. It was something deeper, something that came from the soul, a choppy, muffled sound, a desperate sob from someone who spent too long waiting for this moment. The old man's arms closed around her tightly, his fingers getting lost in the rough fur, holding her as if he were afraid that if he let go, this would all be just a cruel dream. "My girl." Her voice was weak, broken by emotion. "You're back." He buried his face in her, smelling the earth, the smell of the road, the smell of everything she had faced to get there, but most of all, smelling her. The smell he never forgot. She was wagging her tail non-stop, her paws barely able to stay steady. He licked his hands, his face, his arms, whatever was within reach. She needed to feel, needed to know that he was real, that this moment wouldn't be taken away from her again. The surrounding volunteers said nothing. There were no words capable of translating what they were witnessing. Some pursed their lips, others looked away to discreetly wipe away the tears that insisted on falling. But everyone felt the same thing. They knew they were looking at something rare, something precious, something you don't see every day. Because it wasn't just a rescue, it wasn't just a dog finding its owner. It was life showing that despite all the pain, there is still room for miracles. The dog remained attached to the elderly man, as if afraid that if she let go for a moment, everything would disappear like a cruel dream. His body was shaking, but no longer from the cold or hunger. I was shaking from the overwhelming release of emotions, from the relief that came after so long of uncertainty. She pressed her nose against it, as if she wanted to memorize that smell, as if she needed to be sure it was real. The elderly man wasn't just holding a dog. He held a piece of his own history, something he thought he had lost forever. His face was wet with tears that he no longer made a point of hiding. Every wrinkle on her skin seemed to carry a different emotion: pain, longing, love, relief. He held her head with trembling hands, his fingers digging into the rough fur, as if he wanted to feel every detail, as if he were trying to convince him that she was really there. And then, in the midst of that silence full of meaning, a whisper escaped the elderly man's lips. "I never stopped waiting for you." It was at that moment that the dog let out a low whine, a broken sound, almost like a sob. Her eyes, shining with emotion, closed for a brief second as she snuggled further against him. Anyone looking from the outside might think it was just a dog and its owner, but those who really understood knew it was much more than that. It was more than a reunion. It was fate righting a wrong. It was a heart coming home. But then, something unexpected happened. The dog, still panting, still curling up in the elderly man's embrace, as if she wanted to recover in seconds all the time they had spent apart, suddenly stopped. Her breathing slowed and she pulled away slightly, just enough to turn her head back. His gaze, once filled with longing and emotion, now had something else. A silent call, a need that went beyond their own reunion. The puppies. They were there, huddled in a corner, watching everything with big, curious eyes. They were too small to understand what was happening, but they felt the change in the air. Since birth, their world had been made up of nothing but fear, cold, and insecurity, and now suddenly something different was happening. Their mother, who had always been the center of their little universe, was there, but she was also different. They didn't know what it meant, but they felt it. The bitch hesitated. She looked at the puppies, and then at the elderly man as if she needed him to understand what she was trying to say without words. Something shone in her eyes, something that mixed pride and concern, something only a mother could feel. She couldn't just leave. She couldn't forget that now it wasn't just her anymore. Her family had grown, and she needed to make sure the man in front of her understood that. And then he understood. The elderly man followed her gaze, and for the first time, his eyes met the small bodies that had barely begun to live. The cubs, fragile, defenseless, crowded against each other, still so new to the world that they didn't know whether to get closer or just continue watching. Time seemed to stretch between that exchanged look. Surprise gave way to understanding. The elderly man blinked a few times as if processing what he was seeing. Then he turned his gaze to the dog, who now remained next to the puppies, lying down next to them, protecting them, making it clear that those little ones were also part of her. He smiled, but it wasn't just any smile. It was a smile filled with infinite tenderness, silent acceptance. "You became a mother." Her voice was low, almost like a whisper, but full of affection. The dog barked softly, a short sound almost like an answer, as if saying yes, as if confirming something that didn't even need to be said. Her eyes were still on him, waiting for something that perhaps even she didn't know how to put into gestures. He passed his hand over his face, wiping away the tears that continued to flow silently. His eyes turned to the woman who had made the rescue, and in that moment, no words were needed. He just nodded, and in that gesture, the entire answer was given. It didn't matter that there were now more mouths to feed. It didn't matter that he was old, and that caring for puppies was a challenge. None of that mattered. The family was complete, and he would never lose her again. Have you ever stopped to think about the strength of love? Not that temporary conditioned love that changes according to circumstances, but genuine love, that which resists time, suffering, and uncertainty. The one who survives even when everything around seems to fall apart. If there's anything this story teaches us, it's that true love is never lost. The bitch could have given up so many times. When she was torn from the home she knew, when she found herself alone for the first time, when hunger and cold made her days a silent battle, she could have succumbed to despair when her cubs entered the world in a hostile environment where there was nothing but her to protect them. But she never gave up. He never let the pain speak louder than the instinct to love. She resisted, fought, and even when she was taken to a shelter, she still felt that her mission was not complete. She knew that a part of her was still out there, lost, waiting, even without strength, without certainty, without knowing if she would be able to return. She tried, because true love knows no limits, sees no barriers. And then there is the elderly, who also never gave up. He could have accepted the absence and moved on. He could have believed that his companion of years was gone forever. But even without guarantees, he continued looking. Even though he didn't know if he would ever see her again, he kept hope alive. Because when love is true, it doesn't fade with distance. It doesn't wear out over time. When their eyes met again, everything they had experienced came back in an instant. Time apart no longer mattered. None of the difficulties they faced were able to erase the bond between them. The dog, now a mother, looked at the man who never gave up on her, and he, now elderly, looked at the friend who always believed would come back. They had both been through so much, but in the end, love brought them back to each other. This story is not just about a rescue, it's about bonds that don't break, about the ability to love even when everything seems lost, about loyalty, about believing, about never abandoning those who depend on us. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson dogs teach us. They love without expecting anything in return. They are faithful even when the world turns its back on them. And if we are lucky enough to be loved by one, we will know that this love is pure, unwavering, and eternal. True love is never lost. It can be tested, it can be challenged, it can even be separated by time and distance. But in the end, he always finds a way back. Stories like this remind us of what really matters, the love that is never lost, the loyalty that crosses time, and the hope that endures even in the most difficult moments. And now you are part of it. By following this journey, you felt the emotion, lived every moment, and in some way connected to this story. And just like this dog never gave up on those she loved, you too can make a difference. By leaving a like and subscribing, you help this message reach more people, spreading even more stories of overcoming and unconditional love. Comment, "Love always comes back," to show that you believe in the strength of this reunion. And if this story touched you, wait until you see what comes next. The next video is already on the screen and brings an even more exciting story, the kind that gives you goosebumps and leaves your heart racing. You won't want to miss it.